Good evening, my fellow hunters, and welcome back to Bloodborne. Last time we had explored how Yharnam had changed due to the advent of the Blood Moon, and this time we're going to be doing some fine dining. The main course? Blood. No. We're actually going to be exploring a completely optional side area today, so no main plot progression as such, but you'll get to see a pretty cool area, one of the coolest in the game prior to the DLC at least. And appropriate for that area, we're going to be wearing fancy clothing. You'll see why that's appropriate once we get there. But before we do that, let's buy some shaman bone blades that we won't ever actually use. Sorry about that, I always forget to use the damn things. Just reorganizing the hotbar, figuring out where to actually put the damn things. I always like to keep a certain order. And let's go give the messengers that white ribbon we picked up last time. The reward, as it were, for a rather morose questline. Something that I did not mention in that video or show was the fact that if you actually stand outside Gascoigne's house after giving the daughter the ribbon, she'll actually have some extra dialogue, hinting at that she may have sent out her older or rather younger sister, so that she could obtain that ribbon that she was so covetous of. Which makes that questline even more depressing. So, as far as figuring out that this area exists or how you get to it, that's done through this item we got here from Yosefka's clinic, a Cainhurst summons, bloodstained, inviting an honored guest to the forsaken Castle Cainhurst, and that, rather bafflingly, is addressed to us. It tells us that the stagecoach leaves from Hemwick Crossing, and we've been to Hemwick Channel Lane. You know, this is starting to seem like it's not such a great idea, but we've come all the way here, so we might as well continue on into this rather ominous carriage. Welcome, one and all, to the forsaken Cainhurst Castle. It's questionable how we even got here given the broken bridge and the long iced-over carriage with the dead horses, but don't think too hard about it. Something insight. I've often heard it said that the Souls games, and thus Bloodborne by extension, are like 3D Castlevanias, more so than the actual 3D Castlevania games. And while I don't entirely agree with that statement, it's kind of hard to argue against it when you have an area like this that really does feel like it was heavily inspired by Castlevania. But enough about comparing two different wonderful video game series. First we have to deal with this asshole of an enemy right here, the Bloodlicker. These ladies, these ticks, are probably one of the more infamous enemies in the game, and one of the hardest ones to deal with for that matter, even including the DLC, where the enemies themselves tend to be pretty dangerous. They deal very high amounts of damage. Their attacks are either incredibly quick or incredibly sweeping and thus difficult to avoid, and they can attack you pretty much anywhere where you are around them. They can hit you from the front, from the side, and from the back, as you saw with that donkey kick there with the first one. And that's just facing one of them. If you're not careful, you can easily end up getting ganged up on by 2 or even 3 of them at once, at which point you're pretty much just dead. You should just get it over with and try again from the beginning, taking them on one at a time. All that said, the Threaded Cane really helps with taking these guys out. The N-Transform mode has quick enough attacks that you can easily get in attacks in between their attacks. Say that 5 times fast. Meanwhile, the Transform mode has absolutely ridiculous range on all of its attacks, and is probably the best quality of the weapon, really. Makes it fantastic for dealing with tough enemies that you can keep at range to prevent them from ever hitting you, as well as good at dealing with crowds for that matter. Definitely one of the better weapons in the game, even if it's also one of the harder ones to use, due to the slow speed of those transformed attacks, and their kind of weird hitboxes. So here we see some more parasite larvae, as well as me employing an editing technique that you'll see quite a few times in this video here. The enemy placement in Cainhurst Castle is kind of bad, honestly, which is quite a shame, since the level design itself is fantastic. And the design of the individual enemies is pretty good as well, but they pretty much just plop a bunch of each of the enemy types that appears in this area at various intervals. There are exceptions to this, of course, but they are exceptions and not the rule. And you can see an example of that in the outside area here with these parasite larvae. They're just kind of all around here and you just gotta kill them all and that's it. There's nothing really interesting about them. And again, the Threaded Cane comes in super handy here for dealing with them. As long as you stay at a distance and use the transform attacks, they can't do a thing about it, even with their bullshit leaping attacks and ridiculously tiny hitboxes. That and appropriate theming are why I've saved the Threaded Cane until this video. So, what do we get for taking out all these rather difficult enemies? A blood gem. That's it, and it's not even a particularly good one. It's worse than all the other ones we currently have, including ones I'm pretty sure that we picked up in the Forbidden Woods, an area that you have to go through to get to this area. What I'm saying is, do not bother killing the parasite larvae in this area here, just ignore that part of this outside area entirely. It's not worth it. Continuing along the upper part of this outside portion of Cainhurst Castle, we actually start to approach the castle proper. More Bloodlickers, oh boy. Let's use a poison knife to draw out this one without alerting her buddy over there. Yeah, it didn't go so well. Probably their most dangerous attack is that leaping attack there. It covers an absurd amount of ground and does ridiculously high amounts of damage. As you saw there, it took around 80% of the health bar. If you try to get away from them for some breathing room to heal or just to relax for a second, they'll often use that and just kind of wreck your face entirely. So despite how dangerous they are at close quarters, it's typically best to stay close to them, just so they don't do that attack. And right there, that was probably the best we've done so far at killing one of them. You can actually see my skill at fighting them improving as we go through this first bit of the area here. I'm not as experienced at dealing with them as most other enemies in the game because they don't really show up all that much. And in most of my playthroughs after my first, I just run past them because it's not really worth fighting them. All the items in this area aren't particularly important or useful. But for the sake of the LP, I of course have to show them off. And if you can get them to behave just right, you can take them out with no issue just kinda spamming your weapon. Unfortunately, that's rarer than it is common. Well, so much for me getting better at dealing with these guys, I suppose. But there's cause to rejoice, for that was the last bloodlicker that we're going to have to deal with in this area. Well, there's one more, but she's kind of a special case. She ate just a bit too much blood and is now quite bloated. And that's not really a threat to us. She's also trying to show us her butt for some reason. I don't really want to think too deeply about that. But it certainly makes her easy to take out, despite her, I think, larger HP pool than the others. I'm not entirely sure. Ew. Probably one of the more gratuitous blood explosions you'll see in the game. But now that we've cleared the outside of all of its residents, let's actually head into forsaken Cainhurst Castle proper. That's not ominous at all. And neither are these ghastly wailing noises apparently coming from nowhere, that's for sure. Let's take out these guys before they prove to be troublesome. Even though they don't seem to be doing much. Oh, what? Hey! So that's the little trick in this area here. Though it seems largely devoid of enemies, there are in fact many ghosts around. And they will pop in once you've spent enough time in the area, or past a certain point. Again, I'm not 100% sure of what it is that causes them to appear like that. Prior to them appearing though, they have not properly spawned and so you cannot hurt them. Fortunately, they're not a terribly dangerous enemy type. They're not very aggressive at all, and with a weapon that can attack from a far distance, like the threaded cane here, they're complete cake to take out. That said, they have a large amount of HP and take especially long to take out because we're a bit underpowered. This area is probably balanced for a +9 weapon and all we have is a +6. But for killing all of them, we can easily access this treasure chest containing a truly worthwhile treasure, especially for this game. And that is the Vita Palash. Wielded by the Knights of Cainhurst. The old nobles, long-time imbibers of blood, are no strangers to the sanguine plague, and the disposal of beasts was a discreet task left to their servants, or knights, as they were called for the sake of appearances. It's a pretty damn cool weapon, and I'll be showing that off relatively soon in the future, at least as far as episode count goes. Quite possibly not so much in terms of absolute time, given how long it takes me to actually put these out, but we'll see. So as I've mentioned a few times now, the threaded cane is an excellent weapon for this area. So let's discuss it a bit more in depth. The untransform mode is a sword cane with very quick attacks but poor outward reach. The R2 heavy attack in particular is an outward thrust, but has much shorter range than the similar thrust attack of the silver sword of the Ludwig's Holy Blade or the Kirkhammer. But its especially quick attacks give it pretty high DPS, and they're wide enough sweeps to be good at dealing with multiple enemies at once. Here we pick up another bloodstone chunk. These are a somewhat common item in this area, so if you don't yet have a weapon that is past +6, you can pretty easily achieve that by going through here. Not all the way to +9 where chunks stop being used to upgrade the weapon, but probably to either +7 or +8. We of course won't be doing that because chunks are pretty limited in general in this game, so I'll be saving those for later weapons that I'll plan to use in the endgame. Oh yeah, that's not suspicious at all. Yeah, that's about what I expected. So, getting back to the Threaded Cane, one last fact about its untransform mode is that it has a 20% Righteous bonus, meaning it deals 20% more damage to enemies weak to that Righteous bonus, a group of enemies that is so small that I'm not even entirely sure of all the enemies that are in that group. That aside, we now have a rather pretty dress. So, let's check out what the item description has to say. If I can find it, that is. Inventory's getting a bit full here. A finely tailored Bordeaux dress, worn by the nobles of the old bloodline that traces back to the forsaken castle Cainhurst. And it's a dress that looks awfully familiar. I'm pretty sure we've seen someone wearing that before. Or at least a highly similar looking dress, but can't quite place it at the moment. By the way, have I yet mentioned that this area is very pretty? Because it's very pretty. It's also rather sneaky. If you pay especially close attention, you'll actually see an enemy in this shot. Right there. A grey-skinned gargoyle trying to disguise itself as one of the many pieces of statuary strewn about the castle. If you walk forward, he will quickly hop forward and grab you, quite possibly killing you if your health isn't high enough. But if you spot him from a distance, he's not too difficult to take out, especially by his lonesome. I mentioned before that the enemy encounter design in this area isn't terribly good, with a few exceptions, and these enemies here are one of those exceptions. In each instance that they're encountered, they're placed in some new way in an attempt to trick or trap you. In that case, had you proceeded forward without ascending that tower, he would have flown after you and surprised you from behind. Instead, he clips through the floor here. Well, I ain't complaining too much. It actually is rather unfortunate since these enemies drop both twin bloodstone shards and, incredibly rarely, bloodstone chunks, so anytime they're killed without being able to loot their corpses is unfortunate. Two more facts about them before we continue onwards. One is that they're one of the few enemies in the game that are weak to that 20% righteous bonus I mentioned earlier. Yet another reason why the Threaded Cane is such a good weapon for this area. The other fun fact is their name, which is one of the more evocative ones in the game, that being Lost Child of Antiquity. At any rate, here we come to another Cainhurst servant, this one already active, not scrubbing the floor like his brethren. Let's try and get the jump on him. Well, that didn't work out as well as I'd hoped, but hey. These guys can actually be fairly dangerous if you underestimate them, but at the same time they're incredibly easily cheesed with bullets. A single one will send them flying back, making them easy pickings. And here we see an example of why the message system in these games isn't always the best. And that's as much as I'll say on that. At any rate, continuing on here. We could head inside, but let's check out this very short outside portion first. I feel like this was meant to be some sort of trap, like you were expected to rush in to get that item and then be surprised by the two gargoyles, but I really don't see how anyone could ever actually fall for that, even if they were recording the game and doing live commentary like for a video or a stream or something. I really don't see how you could be paying that little attention to be trapped by it, but hey, I'm sure someone has. And I can't really speak from too high of a plane since I got grabbed by the rather easy to avoid grab attack there. And that's from just me playing, so yeah. But they're worth dealing with because the item they got, or items rather, is very valuable. The Executioner's set. Attire worn by the band of executioners commanded by the Mater Logarius, who we've heard of before. Alfred has mentioned him. As the great Logarius once said, acts of goodness are not always wise, and acts of evil are not always foolish, but regardless, we shall always strive to be good. We'll be learning more about the executioners both later on in this video and later on in the game. For now, let's head backwards and head further into the castle here. Here, we pick up a Vile Blood Register, as well as unlocking a very useful shortcut. While heading down this elevator, let's check that register out. I won't read any of the description, but suffice it to say, lore implications aside, this is an online item, a ranking list, for one of the few covenants in this game, similar to the League and the League staff. But as for the shortcut, it heads out to the elevator, the closed elevator that we saw at the beginning of the level. It would probably be wise to head back to the Hunter's Dream and restock on blood vials before heading further in, but we're a brave, dashing sort, so let's continue on regardless. So, there are a lot of ghost ladies here, but they're more distraction than anything else from the actual threat. The one that pegged us with that projectile there, giving us that curse mark on our heads. It's these candle-wielding servants here. They will snipe you from afar, hitting you with their blow dart and leaving that curse mark. Aside from being able to stun you while you're fighting the ghosts and thus leave you in a rather tricky situation, they're threatening because that curse mark makes it so that any others of their kind will automatically target you and shoot at you while that mark is up. And there are a bunch of them in the upper portion of this area, which means if you get hit with that mark, you're going to be sniped by a bunch of them potentially, depending on where exactly you are. And that's what makes them so dangerous. Before we continue upwards into progress, we're going to do this little platforming bit here to get this extra piece of treasure. A very worthwhile piece of treasure, and one of the reasons that we've been upping our blood tinge at the doll lately. It is a pistol, much like the Hunter pistol, but it scales far more strongly with blood tinge than the regular Hunter pistol. At greater than 25 blood tinge, it is the second strongest pistol in the game, beaten only by the repeating pistol, but being much more ammo efficient. Essentially, it's damaging enough per shot that it's actually an effective means of long-distance combat, and is fantastic for cheesing certain enemy types and even some bosses, which I'll hopefully get the chance to show off. At any rate, the upper area here is filled with Cainhurst servants, both the rapier-wielding variant and the candlestick and blow-dart-wielding variant. This is probably one of the more dangerous parts of the level, honestly, aside from the initial outside portion with the bloodlickers. While you're fighting the rapier-wielding servants, you'll most likely get sniped by one of the blow-dart-wielding ones. And then you'll just end up getting stun-locked to death, and it's not pretty. And even if you're just fighting the rapier-wielding ones one-on-one by themselves, they can still be pretty dangerous due to their pretty fast attacks. If you get careless, you will die very easily here. But as long as you know when to back off and heal using your blood vials, you can avoid death easily enough. Case in point of them being so dangerous, that was probably one of the worst fights I've had with an enemy in the game so far. Not sure why I didn't think to transform my cane into its sword form, which is much faster and would be far more appropriate for that sort of fight, as you can see right here. But we survived it, and that's really all that matters in the end. So, let's get back to talking about the threaded cane, since we won't be seeing anything particularly interesting for a bit here. Forgive me if I end up repeating myself a bit, but I'm recording this commentary in multiple segments, so I don't exactly remember what I talked about. But I'm pretty sure last time I finished off discussing the untransform mode of the weapon. So let's talk about the transform mode, the whip mode, aka the Belmont mode. It features slow but wide-sweeping whip strikes for pretty much all of its attacks, either horizontally in the case of the R1s or vertically as in the case of the R2s. Basically, this thing can cover all sorts of reach, and it is excellent for dealing with crowds of enemies or dealing with enemies at a distance, hitting them from outside their attack range if they have short enough reach. Of course, the flip side of that is that close range, especially versus quicker enemies, it can be very difficult to use, as you saw against that Cainhurst servant a while back. He just kept stun-locking me despite my attempts to attack him and stun-lock him back, due to the whip's slow speed. Also, a brief aside here, this isn't the last time that we'll have to be paying attention to the environment in order to traverse across rooftops like this. Something important to keep in mind if you want to actually progress through the level. Getting back to the threaded cane, one other feature of its transform mode is the fact that the hitboxes for the attacks can be a little bit strange at first. A lot of times you'll use them and you may end up missing enemies, especially if you're close by, due to those strange hitboxes. So this weapon has a bit of a learning curve, but once you learn how to use it, you can just wreck your way through the game without taking any damage by attacking at maximum range and just dealing with groups of enemies with no difficulty at all. Two last things about the weapon. One is that the transform mode has a special damage bonus, much like the untransform mode. Rather than being a 20% righteous bonus, it is a 20% serrated bonus, dealing extra damage versus beast-type enemies, and as such comes in a lot more handy throughout the game, since there are plenty of beast enemies, but not very many enemies weak to the righteous bonus. The other last thing about the weapon that I wanted to mention is that the transformed attacks are excellent. The untransformed to transform being this long vertical sweep, which is really good at hitting distant enemies, and the transform to untransform mode being this cool little flick back into its untransform mode that is pretty quick and does a good amount of damage. But that's about all I have to say about the threaded cane, so let's look at the knight set here. Attire of the Knights of Cainhurst. The Cainhurst way is a mix of nostalgia and bombast. They take great pride even in the blood-stained corpses of beasts that they leave behind, confident that they will stand as examples of decadent art. Really, that description alone says volumes about the people that used to live in this forsaken castle. Over here we have another bit of treasure, this one potentially even more valuable depending on your build. The Executioner's Gloves, which aren't actually a piece of armor despite what you might originally think. They are in fact an arcane hunter tool and our first purely offensive one. The beast war has some offensive applications, but this is the first one that actually does damage. The gloves of an executioner from a faraway land, passed from executioner father to executioner son. These gloves can be used to summon wrathful spirits of the past by smearing them with blood. You know, this is gonna seem apropos of nothing, but one thing I really like is when you have a fantasy setting that at some point ends up actually advancing into the future, achieving a level of technology similar to our own, or at least a level of technology closer to that of the modern era. And I just can't help but imagine if there was a theoretical Bloodborne sequel that did just that it would have something to the effect of having to slit your wrists every time you want to go open a door, or take an elevator or something like that. Just a shower thought, I suppose. Also a brief shout out to my bro the Gargoyle, who's not that good of an ambusher. If you're gonna ambush someone, at least face them. At any rate, here we unlock what is kind of a shortcut. It leads back to where we were before, the beginning of the big room with all the Cainhurst servants and ghosts. But there's no reason to actually cross back and forth forward, because unlocking this little shortcut back is what also unlocks progress forward. Just an interesting bit of level design that I can't really find the words to describe, but probably one of the better parts of the level. That blood gem right there is pretty garbage. It increases blood tinge scaling, but the effect on the actual damage is so negligible that it doesn't really matter. The roughly 10% blood attack increasing blood gem we got way back and that we used a bit on the guns at one point is significantly stronger than it. Basically, in general, the scaling gems are pretty poor, with a few exceptions that I'll bring up when they become more relevant. At any rate, continuing on here, we're actually near the end of the area, very close to the boss. But first, we'll have to deal with these last few lost children. This one here is a bit tougher as indicated by his glowing red eyes, but not that much tougher. He's really only a threat if you rush for this item and get ambushed by these other two lost children along with him. But if you take him out first and then his buddies here, they're not really a threat. We'll check out the description of that knight's wig in a second. Nothing particularly new since it's just part of the knight set, which we'll get to see when we equip it later on. I'm not exactly sure when I'm going to do that, but I will show off every armor set at some point, in case you were worrying about that. Force damage falls are never fun. Even if the damage is only incredibly minor, they're always aggravating in games like these. If you're playing through this area for the first time and you're replete with blood echoes, I would highly recommend using one of those bold Hunter's Mark to warp back to the dream and strengthen yourself before venturing onwards. Because before us lies one of the hardest bosses in the base game. Hard enough that facing him with so few blood vials is a little worrying, so let's equip that Yosefka's blood vial that we've been carrying around for quite some time, as well as the blood of Adela, and see if they help any as we fight. Crusty old man. No, wait, I mean Mata Logarius, who we've seen mentioned a few times in item descriptions, and spoken of quite reverently by Alfred. Keeping with the Castlevania influences of this area, I would describe Mata Logarius as an unholy cross between Death and Dracula from the classic Castlevania games. He's got the weapon of the former and the magic casting ability of the latter, and annoying ass projectiles? Oh, just wait till we get to the second stage of the fight to see that. As for this first stage here, Logarius will primarily use magic attacks. Of them, the only particularly dangerous one is the close range one he uses to get you off his back. Just dodge away and it won't hit you. More notably, he has a few melee attacks that he can actually be staggered and visceral attacked out of. And that leads to the second phase of his fight in a way that I think is somewhat unintended. Essentially, the way it's supposed to happen is that when he gets to around 60% of his maximum HP, then he'll fall to the ground and begin a fairly long casting animation, which you can charge attack him in the back and then respond with a visceral attack to punish. For whatever reason, doing a visceral attack that causes him to be lowered below that HP threshold will have the same effect, and just rocket him straight to phase 2 without that charge up. This is actually quite handy because if you fail to knock him out of that casting animation, which can only be done with the visceral attack by the by, then he'll enter phase 2 in a buff state that lasts until you kill him. That buff state being the fact that he will sometimes deflect bullets, making him much harder to actually stagger. And he also will not be stunned by your attacks anymore, meaning you can't really spam against him. That said, as long as he's not in his buff state, the second phase is arguably much easier than the first, as you can repeatedly chain, stagger, and visceral attack him as you're seeing here. Really, the only threatening part of this final phase is the attack where he plunges a sword into the ground and summons swords out of the sky to attack you. That can really screw you up. But as long as you just get rid of it immediately by shooting it as soon as it becomes corporeal, which is right after it does that AoE, then it's not really a threat. And he can be taken down without too much issue. So aside from receiving a boatload of blood echoes, an item has appeared at the beginning of the arena here. The Crown of Illusions, something we'll be checking out right now, because it's a fairly important item. One of the precious secrets of Cainhurst, the old king's crown is said to reveal illusions and expose a mirage that hides a secret. What visions did Logarius see, sitting serenely upon his new throne? Well, the only way we could ever hope to know that is if we were to sit upon his throne ourselves, with the crown atop our heads. So let's do that and see the silliness of how the blood ends up working out if you take off a helmet that covers part of your face. Well, Logarius' throne is kind of gone, but let's walk over there anyway. One last little area of Cainhurst here, which hides the greatest treasure of all. No need to flee back to the dream, as there's nothing actually dangerous in front of us here.
Visitor, I claim no subjects, but here lieth our throne. Kneel afore us, or get thee gone. Visitor, moon-scented hunter. I am Annalise, Queen of Castle Cainhurst. Ruler of the Vile Bloods, and sworn enemy of the Church. Yet our people are murdered, and we are prisoner to this wretched mask. What is it thou art in search of? Well, well. An odd hunter thou art indeed. We've tired of these piteous nights. Share in our plight, and take oath against the Church. If thou wouldst this path walk, I prithee, partake of my rotted blood. Very well. Drink deep of our blood. Feel the spreading corruption burn. Now, thou art too a vile blood. We too, the very last on this earth. We await thy return, for the honor of Cainhurst.
So, we've now reached the second covenant in the game, and the first and really only proper covenant in the base game, the game without the DLC. The Vile Bloods are hunters of blood and hunt prey as they search for blood dregs. The hunter who joins them is faced with a decision: to merely borrow their strength or to become one of them, heart and soul. And here is their rune, Corruption. Pledges to this oath are Cainhurst Vile Bloods, hunters of blood who find dregs for their queen in cold blood, particularly that of hunters. yet the corrupt are heretics in the eyes of the Church, and thus subject to the wrath of the executioners. It also has a minor beneficial effect when equipped, giving you a very slow HP regeneration when you're at very low health. It's not terribly worth it. And over here we have this unopened summons to Cainhurst Castle. Like the first of its kind, it is an invitation to Cainhurst, but for whom is not known, as it lacks an addressee. I suppose this would be useful to give to someone who wanted to get to Cainhurst Castle, but do we know anyone like that? We'll have to ponder on that at some point in the future. But for now, let's return to the Hunter's Dream, and equip that corruption rune, and feel the burn. For now, we are a true vile blood, and we shall do the order as commanded by our queen, and hunt other hunters for their blood dregs. Next time, PvP.